Let's get it. This is Life's Essential Ingredients with Jeff and a Mike, where we hope to inform, inspire, and transform lives, one essential ingredient at a time. Welcome to the show. Listeners, here we go. Welcome to another episode of Life's Essential Ingredients. Can't believe it. Season 4, episode 19. We have Craig Mattson coming from Grand Rapids, Michigan. If you are a YouTuber and watch us there, you can see we are missing the mic. He is a high school basketball coach amongst many other things that he does, but he's in the tournament and couldn't make it today. And if you're new to the show, welcome. This podcast is part of a nonprofit called C4 Leaders, and we're the only nonprofit to utilize the pizza making process to create space for our companions to be seen, heard, and loved. We also write children's books, obviously host a show, and then we use the most amazing handmade, hand-tossed sourdough pizza to bring out the best in each other. I'm already making Craig hungry. And if you're interested in checking us out in that space, go to pizzadays.org, and it's with a YS to support our work. So I am fired up about this episode and most episodes. Mike and I started this to try and help one person, and it's somehow we're listened to in 56 countries now and 761 cities. But always that one person is me. And so, Craig, don't get it twisted. When you see my head down, I'm busy taking notes because I get so much out of this. And listeners, I highly encourage you to get out a pen and paper. We've had some incredible guests, but Craig has just lived it. And occasionally, I don't think I've ever even used it on the show, but we find a guru, somebody that is all knowing. And I feel like after researching Craig, that he's just lived his life to continue to learn and share and get better from the people that he's been around. And he's been so vulnerable in that space, which is what, in my opinion, has led him to be a guru in the communication space. So I'm so excited because, first of all, I don't know if you're aware, I'm getting all fired up, Craig, but C4 Leaders are the values of how I live my life. And the first C is communication. I'm so excited for this show. But first of all, let's get going before I get too fired up. Craig, he's all over the place, but I think the best place, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Craig, but the modeswitch.com. Craig also has his podcast, The Mode Switch. So make sure you have a listen there. So about our guest, Craig is an organizational researcher, author, and professor who recently published his third book, Digital Overwhelm. Craig's areas of expertise are numerous, including his original research on the disconnection and intensity many American workers feel in their organizational communities. Craig's spiritual wisdom to build a practical framework called mode switching has helped thousands of people transform the stresses of modern work, like email overload, Zoom fatigue, and technological breakdowns, into gifting opportunities. Craig is a deep thinker who loves to explore people's perspectives in the hopes of transforming his life and the lives of the people he served. Craig, thanks for sharing your many gifts with the world, for educating, empowering thousands of students, for having the courage to lean into difficult subject matter and conversations, and for being our guest on the show. Welcome.
I thank you for that. I thank you for that very much, Jeff. When you talked about the guru term, I felt initially uncomfortable with that. But I see myself as a public learner. Like, I'm somebody who wants to figure things out. And I like to do that with other people like you, but also the people that I've interviewed for this recent book project on Digital Overwhelm. I talked to dozens of Gen Z and millennial professionals. And I'm supposedly the professor, but I felt very much the student in those situations. What is it like to do work and live life in the intense early 2020s? So, I'm a public learner for sure.
Yeah. And that's why, I think it's interesting that you mentioned you were a little bit uncomfortable, but I think that's kind of what a guru is someone that is a lifelong learner and has achieved an expertise, but also realized the game changes every day. And to stay on top of your game and continue to learn in order to be the guru. And in reading your book and just researching you and listening to you, it's like, yeah, I think that is a perspective of someone that doesn't know you has for the work that you've done. And that's
good.
The highest compliments I can give.
Yeah, thank you. I received that, and I'm excited to get into this conversation about life's essential ingredients and what those have shaken out for me.
Yeah. Well, let's go. So you're a first timer, and we always start with a thought of the day. And this jumped out at me, and it's from Gandhi. And here it goes. Happiness is when what you think, what you say, and what you do are in harmony. Why would I do that for you?
Well, I think I have to do some guesswork here, Jeff. So I think that there's a connection between what we think, what we say, what we do. There's such a strong connection among those elements or those parts of our lives that we really can't separate them out. Like sometimes I meet people who describe themselves as external processors. Like they're people who like talk all the time. That's what I'm like. Maybe that's a podcaster's occupational hazard. But then you also meet people who are internal processors, and they're sort of, I want to go alone and think this out on my own. But something that I try to encourage people to recognize is that all of these aspects of human identity, what we do, what we say, what we think, like they're an organic whole. And so you can sort of work out your life by thinking of it in terms of action. You can work it out in terms of just thinking of what you're saying, and you can work it out in terms of what you're thinking. And any one of those dimensions will connect you to the other three. That's my guess. How did I do, Jeff?
I love it. And yeah, I think you hit it out of the park, and we're definitely 100% on it still. But I think in just researching you and again, reading your book, I think it goes back to even that guru of you helping people kind of understand the importance of those three things, and then creating harmony of achieving that. And love how you use the word organic, or words organic whole, because harmony to me, I'll throw in there in that space, when you created that in your life, which you've helped so many people achieve, then you can be happy when what you think, what you say, and what you do are in harmony. So it's going to be a great show.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's get into this thing. And this is we always start out the same way, but I just like the listeners to get to know you. And so this is a broad question, but what was life like growing up? And you can take that any which way you want.
Yes. Well, I feel very privileged to have been brought up in a household that kept together over all of my childhood and my growing up years. And ours was a household that ran on stories. Like, I think that was the most important ingredient of my childhood. My parents read to us kids and encouraged us to get stacks of books at the library, and then also to be creators of stories ourselves at the dinner table and at family gatherings. So I feel like the greatest privilege that I enjoyed as a kid, I mean, I lived in a household that was, I think, by many measures, sort of below the poverty line or at the poverty line. But I didn't feel that. Like, I felt kind of rich, actually. And I think a lot of the reason that I felt well off as a kid was that story was just so ingredient to our household dynamic. So, yeah, that's a little bit about my upbringing.
And then you grew up in the Chicago area. Is that true? Or
I have spent a lot of time in the Chicago area. So I my wife and I brought up our kids in the Chicagoland area. I myself grew up in a little farm town on the southeast side of Michigan, sort of between Toledo and Detroit.
Okay.
And it's Adrian, Michigan. And my parents were educators, and yeah, that was our life.
Mm, I love it. So I gotta ask, since we use pizza, and I did. Oldest daughter went to school in Bourbonnais. I don't know if you've ever heard of Bourbonnais.
Oh yes,
It's
oh
about
yes,
5 minutes south of Chicago. And so we
yep.
spent a lot of time, 4 years, going to visit her. What kind of pie do you like out of?
Well, I should say too that I grew up on homemade pizza. Like that was the sort of weekly routine of our household. Saturday nights, my mom was always making pizza, and I'm now the pizza maker in our house. So, or one of the pizza makers, I should say. That's a little bit of a competitive status, honestly. But yeah, in Chicago, I mean, gosh, that's a pizza town. Like I think that my wife and I really got attached to Lou Malnati's pizza. So that was the pie that we partook of most often, maybe.
I love it. That's my favorite too. And listeners, if you haven't been to Chicago, go. It's an incredible city, but they have deep dish pizza and they put the sauce on top, and it's just something very unique. Make sure you do a lot of walking because the crust is thick and just thick and heavy. But yeah, really good. So let's get into the show a little bit more. So you've mentioned it a couple of times, but at this point in your life, you got a lot going on. You're, man, your own podcast, working as a professor, writing books, got 3 of them out. I know you've raised 4 children, and are married and got a lot going on. But I guess my question is, how do you do it? And what are your life's essential ingredients that you tap into every day that put yourself in a position to go out and do what you do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe I should start by saying I don't do it. Like it sometimes feels like it's doing me. Like life is huge. Life is full. And the reason I chose the word overwhelm in my book title, Digital Overwhelm, is that I think a part of what it means to be human is to just be humbly overwhelmed by all the opportunities, all the possibilities, all the challenges and obstacles and difficulties too. And to just frankly say, yeah, like I'm not some kind of existential martial arts expert here. Like I can just do all this stuff with absolute ease. Yeah, I mean, life is overwhelming. It's full, but there's also a real joy in that. So that's probably the first thing I want to say is just like frankly admit I'm overwhelmed. Like there's more going on than I can keep track of. But I get a lot of joy out of it. And if I can be frank and humble about how full life can be, and how many possibilities there are, then I think I'm doing a little better than if I try to pretend like I'm finessing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. So what is part, do you have a routine though that kind of tap into that does allow you to even have the awareness to know, hey, I'm overwhelmed or I'm experiencing a lot of happiness and joy? I think life can overwhelm us and we go on from thing to thing, kind of stressed out without the awareness of
right.
even feeling.
Yes, I do have some practices that help me to sort of keep my bearings. I sometimes think of this as like an inner tube out in really like a choppy lake. I've somehow spent a lot of my time along Lake Michigan, either on the Chicago side or on the Michigan side where I live now. And one of the sort of fun lake activities is when you have one of those huge inner tubes and then you and your friends try to stand on that inner tube, kind of holding on to each other's arms and sort of propping each other up while you're trying to hold yourself up. And I think that sometimes the practices that help me in a life of overwhelm are practices of friendship. I have 4 other guys that I get together with on a monthly basis. We call ourselves the Diamond Dogs after the Ted Lasso show, but also the song. So yeah, that get together is a space where we 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 lay it out. Like, here's how things are going for me. We check in with each other, um, and yeah, we imbibe some good fluids as well, and tell a lot of stories and cuss it up. So that's an important practice, the practice of friendship. And I think that, sort of professionally speaking, I really try to, in the midst of overwhelm, to try to secure little spaces where I can do deeper, slower, more fruitful work. And I got to say that that is a constant struggle. Like, the digital overwhelm that is constantly badgering us is a real antagonist for productivity. But if we can sort of set aside the notifications, turn on the timer on the reels for TikTok, and secure those quiet spaces, it's kind of remarkable what you can get done. I've found, for instance, that if you set yourself a doable writing goal, I'm a writer, so I try to be constantly writing, try to write every day. And especially in intense periods where I have a deadline or something, to make sure that I'm writing a certain number of words. It sounds so elementary to count your words, but it's just a little bit of a nudge towards making sure you're not gaslighting yourself about what you're actually achieving. So those are a couple of practices. I do try to start the day with a period of quiet and meditation and contemplation. I often will read some, from scripture. I will take time to pray. So I do try to start the day slowly with journaling. Like, that's another practice that's been very important to me. Again, these things don't make the overwhelm go away, but I do think they help you to overwhelm better, if that makes any sense.
For sure. For sure. Well, I'm taking so many notes, but the one word that jumps out at me is practice, and I get them going in my coaching mode with just getting reps, and so, and
Right.
then gaining confidence. So everything that you're talking about, your friendship, just trying to do things a little bit slower, starting with quiet, read, pray, and journaling are all things that you practice, on the daily, by making a conscious decision that these are things that I'm going to practice. And I'm sure you're well aware that in that practice gives you confidence then to deal with life when it starts to speed up,
I like that.
And I think that's one thing that listeners, if we can just take that one piece of what is that for us, can we slow down, drop our cortisol, just be in that space to be ready to ramp it up when we know life is moving fast,
Yeah.
So yeah, I love all those tips. Let's get into you and your teaching. How did you decide? I know you said your parents were educators, but were they a big influence on you choosing your career?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. My father taught physics and math, and my mom was an English teacher, so I sort of straddled the that aisle between STEM focused stuff and the more language focused stuff. I definitely came down on the language side more readily. But yeah, my parents were always thinking how do you make a hard, complicated subject simple and accessible? And it's been my passion for decades of teaching. I really love that challenge, and I have this kind of naive, perhaps, optimism that anybody can understand anything, if it can be broken down and explained and made accessible. And so, yeah, I think you've looked at my book, Digital Overwhelm. In some ways, reading that book will tell you how I teach. That is how my classrooms work. I try to take big ideas, big thinkers, and big questions, and say how can we connect these to lived experience? So that's Yeah, that's how I kind of got into that teaching. Obviously, a book is more like a unilateral mode of communication because it's just like, page after page after page. And in the classroom, that's got to be as it would be on the court for you as a coach. Like it would need to be much more interactive. It would need to be much more hands-on. You know, it's interesting when I started as a professor in the early 2000s, as I think back on it, like I did much more lengthy talks, right? Much more something like a lecture. Today, I do what I call flash lectures. These are just like 5 or 10 minutes long, and I sometimes it feels like a little bit of a loss, or I might look back on a time when people spoke at greater length. But honestly, I think a short, to the point, focused workshop can be just as rich and just as thick as a 60-minute lecture. So yeah, that's a little bit of how I approach teaching too. I write this weekly newsletter for about work culture called the Mode Switch, and I really try to live out that mode switch. Like I think it's easy to get stuck in a mode, stuck in an approach to whatever it is that we're doing. For me, that's almost always a communicational act. But it's easy to think like the way I like to communicate, that's how everybody should like to receive communication. And that's just not the case. So switching up your mode in the classroom for me has been hugely important. But it's also important in just sort of any work context or personal context that I'm in. And that's part of the reason I like this podcast. You're asking not just like what's the one ingredient, but what are the ingredients? And clearly, we need multiple approaches to communication.
Yeah, so much that you shared right there, and definitely, I think having a 60-minute lecture versus a 5-minute just goes back to the compliment that I gave you as a guru. And it's interesting to hear how your parents kind of inspired you, and then how they had that same mindset of taking a difficult subject matter and making it simple and teachable to anybody. Because in order for you to take a 60-minute lecture and turn that into a 5-minute, flash lecture, it's so much easier to speak for 60 minutes than it is.
Yes, it is.
Unless you're a speaker, but you know good and well what I'm talking about, because
Right.
it's more margin. Every word counts when you only have 5 minutes. But my question is, and it's a kind of a naive one, but do you think there's value in training our brain to be able to stretch to maybe 5.5 minutes and then to 6 minutes? Because I feel like we're going so far the other direction, and this is applicable in any industry, even a team. I'm talking to college coaches. They're like, man, my practices are so different now because my players, they're here now, they're getting paid, which is a whole nother thing, but they're here because they love the game. But we have to change our drills every 7 to 10 minutes because they start to tune out.
Yeah.
Or is has that ship sailed, that we're going to try and stretch that to improve our ability to focus? Or are we just going to keep going to the 4-minute flash lecture next year for you because we've just gone so far the other way?
Yeah, it's a heck of a question. I am tempted. I am tempted by the narratives of decline that describe us as just, we're in declension here. We're losing more and more and more focus. Sometimes that story, that way of describing our attention spans feels persuasive to me, especially because some of the most powerful minds and the most amounts of money are put into the design of algorithms that will harvest our attention as efficiently as possible. And sometimes the best way to monetize our concentration and our focus is by snatching it in the smallest amounts possible. At the same time, humans got a human, and humans are just really hard to corral. They are constantly, in a good sort of way, they get distracted and engrossed and preoccupied by things. And so I don't really buy the narrative of decline that is so common in our culture, that we're just getting worse and worse about this. I think, first of all, there are possibilities for strengthening your concentration. The brain is not this sort of irreversible muscle that, once it declines, it can never be strengthened. That's just a really bad metaphor for the brain. We really can strengthen our capacity to focus. So that's a hopeful word. And I think also it's just sort of hopeful that humans are wayward. Like we're kind of crazy. We get obsessed with things, and in that there is a kind of hopefulness, because although the algorithms of our time are really trying to monetize our attention into these tiny little chewable chunks, humans bust out of that all the time. And they are wonderful about becoming fixated on something and giving it all of their attention. So I try to remember that when I feel discouraged about the shortness of my own focus and the brevity of my own concentration. How does that work for you, Jeff? I mean, does that resonate with you, or do you feel kind of discouraged about how short our attention spans are today?
Not discouraged at all. I'm always, that's what's so fun about the work that we do. When you can put people in a position to be human. And I love, if I heard you correct, humans have to human. Said I've never heard that before, but I love that, and I wrote that down. But that's what I love about what we're doing now is when you in fire, which is to evolve as a species forever. It just, I think, takes people back to the core of who they are, and life slow down. And we can, I would say, be where our hands are in this pizza making.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And we can be mindful, and we can focus. It's just, I think, creating, again, opportunities for us to do that. Now, I'm for sure hopeful. And I was helping coach a boys freshman basketball team earlier this year, and was so impressed with these young men and their ability to be kind to each other, their ability to listen, their ability to be coachable, their ability to focus. You're talking about a 14-year-old boy. If you're going to have any, I mean, that's the one. But they prove to me every day that they can do it. And so that's it's just back to the word that you use, practice. There's certain skills that I think we need moving forward, regardless of how fast technology is going to speed us up and overwhelm us. That we need to continue to practice the things that keep us grounded and human.
Yeah.
But no, we're like you, hopeful that we're going to figure it out.
Yeah, I think that even what we're doing right now, I think you were referencing this, just like podcasting has created this form where we just stop what we're doing, especially if we're in the podcast, and we take some time to talk things out. And I think a forum like Life's Essential Ingredients gives people a chance to slow down and say, what is going on here? I noticed that I interviewed dozens of rising professionals for the book Digital Overwhelm, and I was often struck by the generosity of their willingness to sit in a digital space with me and talk to me about how they're coping with the pressures of life and work in the early 2020s. That takes time, Jeff. Like you just that's not billable time, right? They're just sort of thinking about, what is happening right now. But so often the conversations would end with, of course, I'm really thankful that they're willing to talk with me, but they would say also, this has been really good. I'm usually moving way too fast, and this has given me a chance to step back and say, what's up? What's happening? What's going down in my life? And so that's another instance where people were willing to sort of generously give their attention to something. And so I don't feel like it's unusual.
Yeah. Well, we could be talking about this forever, but I definitely want to give you some opportunity. And first of all, congrats on not one, not two, but three books. And I'm sure you got more
Oh, thank you.
coming. Again, we're talking with Craig Mattson coming from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Make sure you go to themodeswitch.com, and he also has his podcast, The Mode Switch. So listen into that. But he's got three books out there: Communication and Social Business in 2018, Why Spiritual Capital Matters in 2021, and then your most latest one in 2024, Digital Overwhelm.
Mhm.
Let's get in. I'll give you a chance if you want to, share any insight on any of those, and we're definitely going to explore the Digital Overwhelm. But
Mhm.
talk about your books.
Okay. So in the mid 2000s, I guess this was 2006, maybe 2007, now that I think about it, a student raised her hand. Her name was Rachel in a in a rhetoric class that I was teaching, and she asked me, "Have you ever heard of Product Red?" And I hadn't heard of Product Red, but we basically threw away the syllabus and spent the rest of the semester analyzing the communication style of this cause-related marketing campaign, which started in 2006 by Bono and Bobby Shriver. And they were basically using corporate social responsibility initiatives to raise money for sufferers of AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. So you'd buy these quote unquote red products, like Starbucks or Nike or Microsoft or Apple or whatever. You could get a red MacBook, so to speak. It didn't have to be that color, but it was branded in that way. And then they would give a part of the profits to this global fund. So yeah, my first book was basically an exploration of this kind of sector where companies, businesses, for-profit companies often are trying to say, like, maybe there's something besides the bottom line in our mission. And so that was my first project. And when you try to do that, I remember interviewing someone in that sort of social business, corporate responsibility space. And she said, "I'm here because it's relatively easy to make money, but doing this is so fascinatingly difficult." She said, "I'm a puzzle solver, and I like the puzzle of this. Like, how can we align what's good for our company with what's good for the world?" So that was my first project. Just thinking about the communication puzzles and the marketing challenges, the branding, conundrums of trying to do work in a pro business, but also sort of pro social space. That was my first book, Rethinking Communication in Social Business. And then the second book, I basically went to 50 social entrepreneurs. So a social entrepreneur would be somebody who's like a nonprofit leader, maybe like you, Jeff, or somebody who is running a company with an explicitly social mission. So this is not added on, but this is like integral to their mission. And one thing I had noticed in my previous book and just sort of hanging around this space was people who do this kind of work have an unusual articulateness to talk about spirituality. So I talk to people from, lots of faith persuasions and no faith at all, and said, yeah, what's spirituality doing in your company? It was really amazing. It was like that question alone was very permission giving, and people just had a lot to say. So those were my first two book projects. One focused on corporate social responsibility, and the other focused on, I guess, what you'd call something like organizational spirituality and well-being. So, yeah.
I love it. Well, let's get in. I don't even know where to start because there's so much great information in your latest book, Digital Overwhelm. Again, just came out in 2024. But should we jump into like the 6 modes of communication? Where do you, you got to guide me on making
Okay,
it.
sure.
It's because there's a lot of good information, and definitely want people to be able to go out and get the book, but also be able to take some great tips.
Sure. Well, thank you. I appreciate the setup there. I think one of my headlines in one of the chapters is "We are all underwater." There's a sense in which our workplaces are just swamped in tools and platforms, notifications and passwords and usernames, and it feels like we're multiplying our digital spaces rather than sort of trimming them. So yeah, I wrote this book honestly to say, how can we cope? Like, how can we deal with that? So I asked rising professionals, because I feel in many ways that the younger generations are people who have both like figured out how to use the tools, but they've also figured out their limits and their shortcomings. And so I asked questions about the intensities of, especially the digital and communicational intensities of the workplace. And out of that came what I called 6 modes of communication. And a mode is sort of like a life raft that we clamber onto when the waves get high. We're just trying to like stay afloat, keep our head above water. And so these various modes were ways of dealing, ways of like, I don't know, keeping your head up and keeping your balance somewhat, your equilibrium, your orientation when things get digitally rough at work.
Mm. Yeah, and
I wonder if you I'm sorry I kind of cut you off there, but I wonder if that description of being underwater like resonates for you. Do you feel like, I don't know, is it an overstatement, or like what's your experience been like?
For sure. Well, I'm a bad example now because I'm retired and I get to block out everything, and I'm not a big tech guy other than record Joe. I'll check emails every now and then. Really don't use a phone a whole bunch. So I'm the worst guy to ask. But when I was working, or my wife is a nurse, and in that space, the technology, for sure, she's underwater. There's so much change, and she's a bedside nurse at a level 1 trauma center in Sacramento and takes care of really sick patients. And the technology has significantly impacted the care that patients receive, just standpoint of charting, and I told you, and listeners, if you're new, not that it matters, but I've been a nurse for 29 years and worked as a bedside nurse at a level 1 trauma center, take care of people shot with bad car accidents, been surrounded by death. And when I was in that space, I'm going to date myself now, but your charting was on paper. Made all the communication processes so much better because the doctors had to come by and read your chart. We're able to interact and have conversations and help each other understand what was going on now. And that probably took about 10% of my time to chart. So I was able to give much more time to the patient and the families. Now, charting probably is about 45 to 55%, all through an electronic, record. And now the doctors just get on the computer somewhere else in the hospital and then send message. So the whole process is different, and the patients have access to it. So you're bombarded, to answer your question finally, Craig, with technology and trying to so many different ways. So what you do would be fascinating for people that are working in a hospital and are bombarded in so many different ways, to allow them to somehow slow life down, to be able to make sense of it, which is why I loved, I'll jump ahead and let you talk about it more, but your first mode, your dialogic mode of communication, having that definition, characterized usually two-way conversation and shaped by the values of equity and authenticity. And that's what I felt as a nurse back in the day. And now I think people that are at the bedside would be able to say that.
Yes, I feel betwixt and between about this, because I know what you're talking about as a patient, like as somebody who sat in doctor's offices. I know that I gravitate towards those doctors who, um, you know, privilege the sort of face-to-face interaction and don't let the screen come in between us. Um, but at the same time, I also feel sympathy because if they don't fill out those charts now, they're going to have to stay after and do it later. Um, I th- I think though that there are ways to be more mindful about our technology use in workspaces that are really kind of human centric. So to kind of stick with the examples of the workspace that you and I have been talking about, like health related workspaces, I hear about doctors who are increasingly using some kind of AI recording device to capture and take notes on the conversation. They have to check the notes afterward to make sure that the AI wasn't hallucinating, which happens a lot. But at the same time, that allows them to sort of be knee to knee, face to face with the patient and privilege that really incredibly important dialogic mode that you were just naming. Yeah, the dialogic mode is so important to, the values of authenticity and equity and reciprocity, the back and forthness that you and I are trying to practice right now in this very podcast. Those are so important to take with us into other spaces. So even when I received an email from you, Jeff, it felt like you wrote in your own voice to me. It felt like an authentic communication, even if it was brief. And I think that whatever our mode of communication, we want to try to figure out how the values that are so important in an interpersonal conversation can show up in other places where that maybe face to face is just impossible. So, yeah, I think it takes creativity. I think it takes mindfulness. And sometimes it takes actually technological development and redevelopment.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I definitely want to have you because I loved, and then I'm going to let you kind of guide. I'm going to start off with a few things and let you get more into it. But when you talk about email, which again, I'm not working now, but my last job was a nursing professor. And so at a community college. And so you get college wide, emails. And so there was a lot of stuff going on and you can get wrapped up into the task of just kind of getting out of your inbox without really putting, into it. And I loved it in your book of, how you talk about force and pitch and quality and rate and share for a listener who might be, thinking, man, I'm in that. I'm getting a couple hundred emails and I just got to get those out of my inbox and be able to get on the next one and hopefully eventually get into work. Just, I liked and I think that's in the introduction. I think that's what I was talking about when I put in, at least on my notes here, I put in quotes, gifting, opportunities. Talk about, how if there is that listener out there that's struggling with it, how they can look at that from a different perspective.
Well, first of all, I just want to be really sympathetic with the listener. The reason that I began, I think the very first mode of communication I talk about has to do with email. I started there because it is a thing that overwhelms me too. And it is a genuine problem in workplaces. This mode of communication that we've created to make things more efficient has done quite the opposite. It's flooded our zones, and it's a kind of an impossible situation. I can't give you a hack that will eliminate your email problems. I wish I could do that. I'd like to do it for myself. But what I can offer you is a mode, or think of it as a posture. If you have a posture, that doesn't mean that you're rigid in that posture and that you never change or that you never gesture, you never adapt to your circumstances. But people recognize your posture. They, even in different contexts, whether you're on the prow of on the deck of a sailboat, or whether you're on a bike, or whether you're just walking down the street, people can look at your posture and recognize it. There's a certain kind of continuity to it and resilience and adaptability to it. And so I think what I'm looking for is a posture towards email. It's not one that eliminates the overwhelm of email, but it's one that allows you to be you in the midst of that. And the posture that I suggested was that of a giver. As often as you can, approach email as an opportunity for gift. I know you can't do that with every email, and it would be kind of ridiculous to treat every email that way. But as often as possible, remind yourself that like this email comes to me from a person who is a gift to me. And if there's some way that I could possibly be a gift back to this person, I don't think that's going to eliminate the too much email that you have, but it is a posture that will help you to be you in the midst of that. You mentioned force and pitch and quality and time, and that was a way to sort of concretely do this. And that is that when you write, as often as you can, try to think about how your email sounds. What's its force? Like, does it kind of come across with a booming volume? What is its pitch? Does it have playful pitches in it? Does it have pitches that are more serious and intense, or empathetic pitches? What is its rate? Does it seem really hurried, or does it also have moments of leisure and just acknowledgement of the human factors between you and the person who's getting the email? So I think sometimes just thinking about how your email sounds can help you to make it more of a gift to the other person.
Yeah, great tips. And again, listeners, if you're struggling in any of these spaces, get the book, Digital Overwhelm. It's a great book. I was fortunate. Craig sent me one and got to read it and got a lot out of it. But speaking of someone that might be struggling, an old guy like me, if I went back to work and I'm working with the younger generation and I'm just not able to communicate well with them, what tip would you give that listener that's just kind of a little bit frustrated maybe and not able to really sit at the table with some of their colleagues, maybe even just feel connected? I mean, maybe a two-part kind of question. One, they just feel like they can't communicate, but two, just disconnected because they don't have anything in common in their mind to come to the table with, so to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's such a vital question. Thank you for that. That's a felt problem for, I think, a lot of us. I was trying to think about some of the ingredients that have been important to me as a working professional. And one of them definitely is the capacity to be curious about people. Sometimes this curiosity comes from the simple fact that I really like to laugh. And just a couple of years ago, I transitioned from one institution to another. And when I did that, I was all of a sudden in settings where basically nobody knew who I was, right? And when you're in those settings, you're just kind of trying to find your way, find how to navigate the unfamiliar. And I found that something would make me laugh. Something would make me stop and say, wait, what? And it would rouse my curiosity. And when that happened, then the unfamiliarity, the strangeness, even sometimes some of the perception of just like radical difference, it didn't go away, but I felt a mode switch in myself, a shift in my mindset, and even a shift in my behavior. And I just found that those things were more manageable. It didn't always happen. Like there were committees that I would be on where I'm not feeling it. I didn't feel that sense of aliveness and humor. But so many times, if I just kind of kept my radar up and I just sort of kept my eyes wide and looked around, that curiosity would help me with people who seem very different from myself or very unfamiliar to me. Does that help, Jeff? Does that speak to your question?
That's great. That's great. I want to let's finish up on your book.
Hmm.
Jump to a part in there where you think, yeah, man, this is the listeners definitely got to share this with them because this is something that really stood out to me. Um, that was just a great lesson, practical
Hmm.
application that they can add to
Hmm.
recipes, so to say.
Yeah, I think that one of the modes that sort of surprised me, Jeff, was the last one that I talked about, and that was the mode of advocacy, the mode of persuasion. Um, I have studied persuasion for many, many years, but it's still some of the hardest work that I do, and it takes a lot of courage to advocate for something. So much easier to be a spectator, right? And so, again, because I had just switched jobs while I was writing this book, I found myself in a setting where I didn't have social capital. I'm a relatively privileged person as a white guy, as a middle class guy, as a middle aged guy. So I'm sort of used to the structures of institutions, the structures of society, like being sort of friendly to me, and my finding it relatively easy to manage and negotiate them. Um, but here I was in a setting where I felt like nobody knew who I was. And so, or almost nobody, I'm somewhat overstating the case here, but I really didn't have the kind of social capital that I'd had at the institution where I'd been for 20 years before. And that was good for me. That was really good for me. And part of what was good for me was I realized, oh, I have to do the work of persuasion here. Some of that was self advocacy, like, hey, my work's important. My work can bring a contribution to this table. Um, my in some way, my work is a gift here. Um, and that self advocacy can be a little bit uncomfortable. You can feel like I'm just sort of like marketing my own brand here. But it can also be a really important professional moment where you just say like, yeah, I don't have to, I shouldn't assume that the people around me just somehow know what I bring to this table. Like it's important to do that work of persuasion for the simple fact that the people around you need to know what you have to offer. And so, yeah, I think for me, the work of the mode of persuasion, the mode of advocacy in the workplace suddenly became very important. And I realized, a little bit to my surprise, that one of the hardest people to do that persuasion with was myself. I just had to persuade myself to do that work, that my work mattered and that had a certain value and dignity to it that um, the work of persuasion would make apparent to other people. Of course, I think it's terribly important also to practice persuasion and advocate for others in your workplace, especially those who don't have the kind of power or privilege that you yourself might enjoy for some weird fluke. And to speak up on behalf of others is also a terrifically important mode of communication in the workplace. And I learned that from the people I interviewed. I heard them speaking up for people who were somewhat disempowered in their workplaces. And yeah, much respect.
Well, I love everything that you're sharing there, and always needed, but definitely, yeah, with everything that's going on in our country, for sure. You know,
Hmm.
out for each other, and all people.
Hmm.
Which kind
Yeah.
of one thing. Last thing I'll ask you about the book. Then I want you to talk about your podcast a little bit too. But in the book,
Hmm.
you describe John Durham Peters using the phrase "caringly served." I don't know why that jumped
Hmm.
to me, but what
Hmm.
does that mean to you in your life?
Yeah. I love John Durham Peters. He's a communication scholar at the University of Iowa. He's a historian, and he's so good at helping us to see how different media, when they show up in our workplaces or in our churches or our schools or just our households, um, how they change the ways that we interact. Um, and yeah, I think that to caringly serve for other people, to practice empathy, to practice neighbor love, to use my own religious traditions language, neighbor love, and even enemy love. Like that is some of the hardest work we do in whatever context that we're in, and also some of the most vital. So I talk about six modes of communication, not just to make you a more effective professional. I hope it does that, but also to enable you to share the gifts of your life with the people around you, to caringly serve for the folks who cross your path and are in the cubicle next to you or on the warehouse floor with you. Or my daughter drove an ambulance last semester in a great American city, and yeah, your partner matters a lot. So caringly serving your clients, caringly serving the person who's next to you in the ambulance matters a great deal.
I love it. I love it. Let's shake it up. I want to be mindful of your time, but let's tell everybody about your podcast, and congrats on that. I can't believe we're getting ready to enter our fifth season. I would have never imagined I would have even been a podcaster, let alone five seasons here. But
that's great.
And tell the listeners about your show.
Yes. So maybe one of the best things about my show is it's not my show. So I work with a team of intergenerational, people who are really focused on vocational formation. They really want to help people do their work in a human way. And so every week we feature a couple of Xers, a couple of millennials, a boomer, so often a Gen Z person. And we have a table. I'm sitting at the table right now. There are 5 chairs, but sometimes we have to pull out an extra mic, and we take on questions like, I don't know, they vary. They're always about work culture, and they're always from an intergenerational perspective. So, the boomer and the Gen Z person, like they will often have very different sort of experiences of similar workplaces. It's a lot of fun. There's a lot of banter, and there's a lot of storytelling. And the podcast generally lasts about 30 minutes, so we try to keep it tight, so you can listen to it on a drive. But it's also a very substantive conversation. The last episode of the last season for 2024, we interviewed someone who really talked about what we're eating at work and talked about food systems and food justice in the workplace. And, I was kind of surprised at just how when you start talking about what you're eating at work, you start talking about just a lot of really wonderful human aspects of the workplace. So that's what we try to do, whether we're talking about workplace communication habits, like we had an episode about why is swearing on the rise at work, or whether we're talking about what you wear to work, or what you eat at work. We're going to explore every conceivable dimension of workplace culture. It's such an important part of human life.
I love it. Again, listeners, the Mode Switch, check that one out. I'm sure it's available on all the platforms.
It is. Yep.
So, and then, getting ready to wrap up. Since you are the guru, I know you're reading and everything. I love asking this question. Any books that you would recommend to the listeners? Mm-hmm. You got to read this.
Yeah. Well, since it's the holidays, I've been doing a lot of fiction reading. And a novel that I just finished it last night, it's just marvelous. It's called The True Believers, and it's by Rebecca McKay. She also wrote a wonderful book about podcasting called I Have Some Questions for You, and that's also a novel. So I would recommend those 2 novels. I'm really interested in reading, I just started this morning, a book called Democracy and Solidarity, and it's by James Davidson Hunter. He's a sociologist, and he's exploring basically the reasons that so many of us feel like democracy isn't working well these days. So I'm very excited about that book. So some fiction there for you, Jeff, but also a work of sociology, Democracy and Solidarity. It seems like I've only read the introduction, but it seems like it's going to be a really good read.
Definitely applicable to what's going on in the world. Yeah, I'm going to have to grab that one. Hey, this has been an incredible show, and sorry to go a little bit longer. Hopefully you didn't have anything else going on. But John Alston has a quote that I love. The only thing you take with you when you're gone is what you leave behind. And you're a young man. Let's give you another 40, 50 years of living. But you're on your deathbed now, and you're surrounded by your children and the people that have been essential in your life, and you're getting ready to take your last breath. What is it you want to leave behind with them?
Wow, that's a deep question. I guess stories of gift. I'll return to where we started, Jeff. Stories of grace and gift. I feel like my own life has been a profound experience of being a beneficiary of other people's generosity. And my hope is that when I die, people have lots of stories where they have felt like they were in that kind of gifting exchange with me, that I was benefiting from their grace, and that they felt like recipients as well. So that's a first shot at your really big and wonderful question.
It's a tough way to end the show, but an incredible one, and I so appreciate the answer. And man, it's been an incredible episode. Again, listeners, Craig Mattson coming from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Go to his website, themodeswitch.com. Check out his books. Check out his podcast, The Mode Switch. And normally my Pasho Mike gets us out of here. But thanks again for listening. Boom, baby. That just happened. We out.